Hello friends, and welcome to Kirby Russia. I'm Tim Kirby. I've worked in Russia for over a decade, written a ton of geopolitical material from here, worked in the media, and in this program I try to share my expertise about the things that are happening inside Russia in the sort of deeper, more long-form sort of format here, so we can try to find the truth together. And there's someone here who also has a ton of experience in the Russian world, far more than me, who's fought tooth and nail to make sure that the breakaway republics in the Donbass region of the Ukraine will survive into the future. His name is Russell Bentley, and he's an American who fought in the initial war and continues now to fight more on the informational side to keep the republic safe. So we're going to talk to him. It should be very unique. He's definitely seen a lot of tough things in his life. But for now, let me get into the little bit of the background about this whole Ukrainian situation to try to explain why things are the way they are. Now, friends, I can tell you one thing. There are some really different people on this planet. People who are a little bit more interested in Russia. Maybe that's a lot of you. Maybe that's why you're watching this program, right? You find Russia kind of intriguing or interesting. And so you're a little bit more willing to maybe hear out this other side of history, this other sort of view of history and the way things work out. But there are plenty of people who aren't that I talk to. You're sort of, I'd call them like Dennis Prager Republican types. And, they're just stuck in this feedback loop of, they'll just say, but Ukrainian independence and Russian aggression and without really thinking about like the context of what they're saying. And you try to appeal to them with, logic and historical facts, and they don't want to hear it. But you know what? If you keep trying to do the same thing over and over again, and expect different results, well, you're the one who's nuts, aren't you? So today, let me try to explain how Ukraine looks from a Russian perspective using maybe, let's just say, a very unorthodox comparison. All right, so let's start that off. Let's go back into a world of alternative history, right? It's the 1970s, I think 1973. There's the oil crisis. And the oil crisis actually hits real hard. It hits so hard, in fact, that it changes everything. That after a few years, President Jimmy Carter gets on TV and he says to the United States public that there's going to have to be some kind of perestroika because our American capitalism is failing to work. It just doesn't work anymore, and we're going to need to make big changes for the country to survive. And by the country surviving, he means selling the country out down the river, and U.S. forces pull out of Western Europe and many other places across the globe. The American economy implodes, and all of a sudden the Soviet masters start to play games with the map of what the world is going to look like in a post-Cold War environment. So the Soviet overlords in our alternative history, so I guess this would be already in the 1980s, take a look at the United States and they see a lot of interesting things. They see there's a Hawaii. Oh, that's full of natives. Well, Hawaii should be then its own independent republic. I mean, there's so many native Hawaiians there. They need to be freed from the grasps of this controlling America, right? Because one thing we have to remember is that America's had the advantage of being a very large country that has been able to bring people in from all over the world and make them feel pretty American, or at least make their kids feel very American and very loyal to America. And if you're going to be in this context of being on the losing side of the Cold War, well, the dominating Soviets are going to come in, and of course, they're not going to agree with this, have America be big and strong, that's very biodiverse with all these different deserts and plains and mountains and different... No. They're going to make sure that that's done with. They're going to take away Hawaii for sure. That's going to become an ethnic republic. They're going to look at the map of the way things used to be before the Mexican-American War, and they're going to award all those sort of southwestern states, not to Mexico, because then Mexico could rise up. They're going to make those into some sort of Spanish-speaking sort of region, and of course they're going to put in everything they can to make sure that only native Spanish speakers get in the government. It's called lustration. Remember lustration that happened to people in former communist countries? If you supported the old regime, you're out. But if you supported the old regime and became a traitor, you're in. So there's going to be definitely lustration politics are going to be happening in those Arizona, New Mexico, maybe California, I don't know, Nevada, whatever, depending how they cut up the country. So they do that. They probably then go look at those Lakota Indians in South Dakota and be like, you know what, guys, we hear you're suffering. About South Dakota, North Dakota, you're now these Indian territories. You guys are free from America, but you're going to have to pay us some pretty cheap prices on all your resources. I mean, that is the price of freedom, right? So the carving and cutting would continue, making sure that the rump of the remaining United States would probably look like basically the territories of the North of the American Civil War. Because obviously, because of the Civil War that happened over 100 years ago, it's just proof that the South is a different culture. I mean, in the South, they say y'all, and in the North, they say you guys. How can two people with two completely different languages live together? I mean, they're absolutely completely different. The pronunciation is different. So many different forms of slang and expressions. Sorry, the South is a completely different culture and would need its own special status as an independent country. At least that's what the Soviet overlords would surely argue. Because the more the South gets shoved away from America forever, that's fantastic for them. Terrible for America, good for them, right? And the people would then, probably the Americans of that time, right? The Americans who are suffering through this, the Americans who in the southwest of America would find themselves now a linguistic minority, or at least on paper, a linguistic minority that would be trounced on to be forced to learn Spanish. These Americans who are now cut off from the rest of the country, living in Hawaii. And first off, with the rest of America, Hawaii's not going to be a very rich place. And when there's no money and there's a fight for resources, things get ugly, especially ethnically. So in Hawaii, there could be some sort of horrible ethnic conflict between white Americans and Native Hawaiians going down. Who knows if emboldened what the Native American tribes of North and South Dakota would actually do to American locals, given the opportunity, we don't know. Probably not much, but you never know. They could, especially when there's resource money being involved. But anyways, there'd be a lot of arguments that seem obvious as to why to keep America together for people living together for hundreds of years, the fact that Southern English is not that different from Northern English, the fact that, in the Southwestern United States they could have a bilingual society and that's not really a problem. The Soviet overlords would not care. They would not care about your reason. They would not care about your logic. They would do everything they can to find people, especially in the big chunk of that South, to find people who are going to say, yes, Soviets, overlord, I do declare that our English is completely different. It is a different language, sir, and we are a different culture, a culture oriented towards your greatness, sir. And that's the kind of people they would find. That's the kind of people they would put in power. And damned if it makes sense or not, because that's what they need. And they would try to pump the South full of these sort of ideologues who despise the North, who hate North, who hate all of these Americans, who say that the Founding Fathers were their guys. They try to, of course, take the Founding Fathers. Remember, because that actually did happen during the Civil War. The South and the North were really in a big debate over whom the Founding Fathers would support. But anyway, so the South would get the Founding Fathers, and there would be this big push to make sure that Northern Americans and Southern Americans, who may even have a different name or something, Confederates, would never, ever, ever be able to get back together again. And these Soviet overlords would pump that South full of these arrogant ideas of their inherent superiority. Oh, how it was the North that destroyed everything. If the evil North had submitted to the greatness of the South during the Civil War, the United States would be one of the greatest nations on earth still. And so on and so forth. And this ugly, insane, hateful scenario of the breakup of America in an alternate reality by Soviet overlords is essentially what actually did happen to Russians when the Soviet Union fell apart. That quote about Putin, when he said that the breakup of the Soviet Union was the greatest political tragedy of the 20th century, he wasn't talking about losing Soviet power or something about communism. They always try to push that in the media that's what he's saying. He's talking about all the millions and millions of Russians who were one day at home and then one day woke up on the other side of a border. And that border was hostile. And the people who took over on that new other side of the border tended to be pretty racist and pretty hateful, especially towards Russians, because Washington liked it that way. All that crazy stuff that I said about this, potential breakup of America by Soviet authorities. That ugliness is what Washington did to people in the former Soviet Union here. That's exactly what happened. That's exactly what happened in Ukraine. And even before that, the Ukrainians had always been lulled by like the Austro-Hungarians and the Poles, tried to play off that Russian sense of inferiority. Unfortunately, probably mostly due to Peter the Great, who's not great. Russians were really convinced that they're inferior to the West. And for a long time, the Ukrainians' ego has always been fed by foreign powers that, no, you're not part of Russia. No, you're not part of Russia. Even though you've been part of Russia since the very beginning, since, ancient times. No, you're different. That's not just an accent you have. No, you speak a different language, a European language. And the Russians are the evil Mongols. No, Ukrainians, you're part of European society. Come clean our toilets. So that's the thing is that's nuts, is that this kind of stuff really happened, and that's what happened. And the Ukrainians, despite the fact that they have always been an integral part of Russia from the very, very beginning, in fact, that they what is inside of Ukraine now is really the cradle of Russian civilization, and that Ukrainians and Belarusians and some other different groups are really just sort of different flavors of Russians who maybe have a little bit of a different accent, but are all basically the same. That doesn't matter. But the key thing to understanding why things are the way they are, my theory of why was the Austro-Hungarian Empire at first, and eventually then the United States during the Cold War and after the Cold War, able to sort of woo the Ukrainians into this weird sort of status where they feel like it's, even though they basically are Russians, that no, they have this different language, we're a different culture, we are part of the West and the Russians are the evil East. It all goes back to Peter I, who is sometimes called Peter the Great, even though he's the worst Russian human being to ever be born. He basically came back from Europe, and rather than just sharing the amazing boat technology he found, he convinced Russians that they're inferior to Europeans. And when the Tsar, His Holiness himself, comes and tells you that you're inferior to the West, you believe it. And that mistake, this inferiority complex, is really at the core of what's happening in Ukraine and happening in the protests in Belarus, is that a lot of times young people who are cool anywhere within the Russian-speaking world, always want to side with the West because they see the West as superior. And I know for many of you, that seems nuts. If you're from the West, you're like, oh my God, look at the West. We're falling apart. We're not having families. We're not birthing children. We're being taken over by some weird lobbies and agendas that seem to be anti-human. Why would you want to be like us? Because the sense of inferiority that those Ukrainians, in quotes, feel about themselves is so deep that it relies on this idea that the West is better. Because if they woke up tomorrow and the West wasn't better than Russia, everything's gone. You'd be amazed at just how much our weird, fragile little egos can play a role even in the big battles of geopolitics. But the real culprit behind what's happening in Ukraine is Russia, not in the sense of some sort of stupid invasion, but the Ukrainians are really a creation of Russians' inferiority complex. Or at least that's how I see things. And this inferiority complex has led to the rise of an ultra-liberal state that uses neo-Nazi foot troops just like they did to do the same things that they were doing to Eastern European villages in World War II. We have entered a realm of complete and total insanity that they call Ukraine. So, let's get into our interview with Russell Bentley, who's seen the insanity firsthand.
And the Donbass especially, which we call Nova Russia, like say from Kharkov to Odessa and everything east of that. I mean, it's absolutely Russian. It's Russian people, Russian language. You know, it was Russian land for 1,000 years. And, you know, like Crimea, it was Russian until, you know, the 20th century when it was changed, you know, arbitrarily to be the Ukraine.
Yeah, the trendy communist revolutionaries thought it'd be a great idea to cut up Russia and redraw the map to represent all these different ethnic enclaves. Basically, they broke apart the country and removed pieces of it that had been part of it for centuries upon centuries.
Ukraine, as Zbigniew Brzezinski once said, Russia and Ukraine together are an empire. Russia without Ukraine is just another country. So, since the end of the Second World War, and certainly in this century, the neocons and the Western powers have been trying to separate Ukraine from Russia. To Russia, Ukraine is really it's a part of Russia. It's Russian people live here. We speak Russian, and at least in the eastern part in Donbass, and at least as far as Kharkov and Odessa, it's the majority of the people are Russian here. We don't, and the important thing to understand is that this war is not Russia against Ukraine. This is a war between normal people who are defending themselves and their homes, their families, against genuine neo-Nazis, the descendants of the Nazi collaborators who joined the German invaders in the Second World War, and who are really only to destroy and kill and steal what they can. And no normal person is going to sit there and let his country or his town or his home be invaded by, raping, murdering, psychopaths. And so that's what we're defending against here. We're not against Ukrainian people. And most of the Ukrainian people are not against Russian people. We have a 1,000-year history of brotherhood between us. It is simply that the United States has taken over. They've empowered quisling oligarchs, and they've, put genuine, mad dog psychopath Nazis in positions of power, given them weapons and unleashed them against us. And so we defend ourselves.
The mainstream media did a fantastic job of masking all that neo-Nazi imagery that would ruin the Maidan revolution. In fact, the national hero of Ukraine, officially recognized after everything was over, is Stepan Bandera, who sided with the Nazis against the Russians during World War II. Check it for yourself. It's on Wikipedia.
The Maidan was a Western, U.S.-backed, U.S.-financed, U.S.-directed coup d'etat, color revolution plus violence. 100 people were murdered in Kiev by snipers, cops, and protesters. It's been proven by physical evidence and by, literal confessions that the snipers were controlled by U.S. Secret Service, and they were ordered to kill both protesters and cops in order just to raise the level of the violence, to raise the tension. That's proven. It's beyond, anyone that doubts it is either an idiot or a liar at this point. So that was the beginning. It was a foreign-backed coup d'etat. They installed, as we know from Victoria Nuland's phone call, that, they chose who was going to be the next government, the next prime minister, the next president. The U.S. chose who it was going to be, and so it's a foreign-backed coup d'etat. And so all the people that cooperate with it are really traitors to Ukraine. And so the people that stand up against that are really the true Ukrainian patriots.
See, this is exactly the point. This is why the breakup of Ukraine started, because certain groups thought it'd be a great idea to go into Kiev and overthrow the government and break up the system, and guess what? The republics out east didn't want to have any of it. If you can overthrow the government, we can secede. Sorry, pal.
That, to be honest, the war was less intense. It was quieter during the years of Trump. And just since Trump has left the White House, it's picked up a great deal. Bro, I've been hearing it 8 or 10 times at least since I've been here, since 2014. I remember in 2015 when I was a soldier on the front lines in Spartak. We got the word, and it was just about this time of year. 6 years ago now, and around middle of March, they said the big one's coming. Get ready. I mean, we were like tearing apart reactive armor to make get plastic explosive to make booby traps. We were trading sugar for gasoline to make Molotov cocktails. We were really expecting it, and there's been so many times. But the fact is that the U-Crops, just since Biden's gotten back into power.
U-Crops or Ukrops are defamatory terms for Ukrainian neo-Nazis.
The U-Crops have been moving tons. 6-8 train loads a night, of heavy armor, heavy artillery moving toward Donbass. There are hundreds of tanks and heavy artillery that were cataloged by OSCE that were supposed to be, 100 kilometers back from the front line under the Minsk agreement that are now gone. The OSCE goes and says, hey, where's those 60 T-72 tanks that were supposed to be in this parking lot? Nobody tells them because nobody knows. But I'll tell you what, they didn't move them back to Kiev. There's 100,000 U-Crop soldiers along the 200-mile front line between Donetsk and Lugansk right now. 100,000 soldiers.
And as one of now the poorest countries in Europe, if not the world, it's your U.S. tax dollars that make this all possible.
They've been bringing them. They used to have rotations, like every 3 months, a unit of Ukrainian army would come serve on the front, and then 3 months later, that unit would go back and a different unit would come forward. Nowadays, the new unit comes forward and the old unit's still staying. They got 100,000 against our 30,000, bro, on the front. And I'll tell you what made me come here, bro. It was because I was and I am a patriotic American. And I came here, dude, I watched, I'm 60 years old, man. I grew up in Dallas, Texas. I remember when Kennedy got murdered. I was in the U.S. Army when Reagan ordered the invasion of Grenada. In fact, I was sitting on an airstrip for the whole weekend as the reserves in case the airborne had problems. We were the ones from Fort Polk that were going to go in to back them up. Dude, I saw 9/11. I saw, Afghanistan, Iraq, the fake WMDs. And what really, really, really made me ashamed of America was the murder of Muammar Gaddafi and the destruction of Libya. Because a lot of people don't know that Libya under Gaddafi, most Americans, they're like, oh, he lives in a tent and rides a camel and wears funny clothes, His country had the highest standard of living in Africa. They had free education. They had free health care, subsidized housing, subsidized fuel. Libyans had a better life than Americans, And the United States went in there and destroyed that country, murdered one of the greatest statesmen of the 20th century. And that really, really bugged me a lot, man. And, it made me start feeling ashamed to be an American.
Well, I've never been ashamed of being an American, but I can say one thing. After the Cold War ended, our foreign policy has gone nuts. If you think about Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Libya, and then before that, the way the Soviet Union broke up, Yugoslavia, it's way too much. I understand that sometimes you have to crack an egg to make an omelet. That's part of geopolitics, but this has gone too far. Way, way too far. U.S. foreign policy has to change.